अभिवादन स्वीकार कीजिए नीरज राव का कल्चर क्वांटम के इस अध्याय में. As promised, this episode is about modern Indian history, and in this episode I am going to cover all the important acts starting from 1773 till 1935. As you know, every year there are questions from this particular section, and it is one of the very important topic from the modern Indian history. So let's start this episode from the background of the administration of the British East India Company in India. Company in India was managed by 24 court of directors, and these 24 court of directors were highest decision making body. They were appointed by the shareholders of the company, and they were also called as court of proprietors. Day-to-day affair of the company was managed by different committees created from these 24 court of directors. In India, there were three presidencies of the company, and these were Bengal, Bombay and Madras. In each of the presidency, there was a president and there was a governor in council. Each and every decision of the company was taken with the majority vote of the council. So this is what was the structure before 1773. In 1773, the situation arose whereby there was a need of the regulation of the affairs of the company. So what was the background of the Regulating Act of the 1773? By 1773, Bengal has come under the control of the British East India Company, and after the Treaty of Allahabad 1765, dual system of administration was implemented in the Bengal, whereby the financial administration or revenue administration, that is Diwani function, was in the hands of the British East India Company, and the Nizamat function or civil administration was in the hands of the Bengal Nawab, who was controlled by the British East India Company. So it was a dual system of government, but in reality it was a dual system of operation of the people of Bengal. And moreover, there were many other issues. There was a severe famine of 1770, and people were reeling under the pressure of the severe famine of the 1770, which swiped near about 1/3 population of the Bengal. Apart from it, there were charges against the company officials that they have amassed so much of corrupt wealth that they can be better called as the Nawabs of London. And in fact, it was very much verified by a secret committee which was appointed by the British Parliament that corruption was very high in the company, and one of the reasons was the private trade. At this point of time, the British Parliament and the British Crown did not want it to be mute spectator when the people of Bengal and the people of India were reeling under pressure, and they wanted to have a say in the company's administration, and the opportunity came. So opportunity was basically company, because of the corruption, was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1770s, and in 1772 company applied for £1 million loan to the British Parliament. Parliament grabbed this opportunity to regulate the affairs of the company, and that's how the regulation of the company started in the form of various acts and commissions. So let's start the very first act, which is the Regulating Act of 1773. The very first provision, the president of company's factory at Bengal or Calcutta was made the governor of British Indian territories. He is not the Governor General of India, but he is the governor of the British Indian territory, and moreover, the governors of or presidents of Bombay and Madras were made subservient to him. Number 2, to assist Governor General, a 4-member governor in council was created in Bengal, and these 4 members were directly appointed by the British Crown. Each and every decision in the council was taken with the majority vote. So effectively there were 5 members, 1 Governor General and 4 other executive members of the council. Number 3, it banned private trade, and company officials were not allowed to indulge in any private trade. Number 4, company officials were asked to provide all the details related to the wealth that they have acquired in India, and this detailed statement must be submitted to the British Parliament. Number 5, the Act laid the foundation of the Supreme Court at Calcutta, with Eliza Impe as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and 3 other judges. Moving ahead with the defects of the Regulating Act of the 1773. Primarily there were 3 defects. Number 1, Governor General was rendered powerless in his council, as all the 4 executive members often outvoted him and he was not able to take any decision. Number 2, the provisions related to the Supreme Court were quite vague and not clearly defined. In fact, there was often a clash between the judicial authority of Governor General and so as Supreme Court. And number 3, despite Bombay and Madras being subservient, they acted on their discretion and they often did not pay any heed to the instructions or the decisions of the Warren Hastings or Governor of the Bengal. So looking at the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773, in 1781 the Amendment Act was passed, and the Amendment Act of 1781 addressed one problem, that is the clear demarcation of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and Governor General, and now Governor General powers were kept above the Supreme Court and there was no such case of the double punishment. So moving on to the next important act, that is Pitt's India Act of 1784. It was named after the British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. This particular act tried to solve the defects of the Regulating Act of the 1773. The very first and the important provision of Pitt's India Act is it led to the beginning of joint rule of British Crown and the British East India Company in India. Moreover, the ultimate authority was with the British Crown, not with the British East India Company. Accordingly, number 2nd provision, Board of Control was created, which was the representative of the British Crown, and it was having 6 members. Board of Control was headed by the Secretary of State, and Secretary of State later on he will become an important position after 1858. But then please remember that Secretary of State was the President of the Board of Control from 1784 itself. And who is Secretary of State? He is one of the Cabinet Minister in the British Parliament. Number 3, to give more powers and to give more importance to Governor General, it was decided that one executive member will be removed from his council, so that if he gets the support of one member, so with the casting vote he can go ahead with his decision. So now effectively there are 4 members in the Governor General Executive Council, 1 Governor General, and so as the 3 executive members. Number 4, the independent powers of the Bombay and Madras was taken away, and now they were made completely subordinate to Bengal. So now they were completely subordinate to Bengal in the matters of war, revenue, legislation, everything. Earlier they were just subordinate, but it was not defined in what sense, but now in every sense they have been made subordinate in 1784. It's an important point to remember. Number 5, for the first time the company's position in India was called as British possession in India. And another provision of this particular act, we can say that number 6 provision was Pitt's India Act of 1784. It forbade company to interfere in the native affairs of India, but this was seldom observed. As far as the defects of the 1784 is concerned, it was also not able to achieve much success. The reason is the nebulous connection developed between the Board of Control and Court of Directors, and the relationship was highly subjective. Moreover, still the corruption continued because there was no effective control and there was no effective mechanism at the place. Other than that, Governor General was still rendered powerless because once again the 3 executive members were ganging together and outvoting the Governor General Warren Hastings. The next important act was Charter Act of 1793. Charter Act of 1793 renewed the company's charter for next 20 years. That means that till 1813, the company's powers will be intact in India and their monopoly will be intact in India. What are the other provisions related to it? In 1785, new Governor General Cornwallis was appointed and he demanded overriding power in his council. Initially, he was given overriding power, but in 1786, with the special act of the Parliament, he was further given overriding power in his councils. Second important provision of this act is it allowed a company to increase its dividend by 10%. One of the very important provision of this act was redefining and reorganizing the courts in India. Earlier, there used to be the revenue courts which were called as the Mal Adalats, and now revenue administration was completely divorced from judiciary functions, and it also led to the disappearance of the Mal Adalats. Next important provision of the Charter Act of the 1793 is that it called for written laws in India, and it maintained that the rule of India or the governance of India must not be based on the personal rule of the rulers, but in fact written rules must be there or written laws must be there. It also said that all these laws and the written rules must be translated in Indian languages also, so that the people can know about their rights and immunities. Last but not the least, it also said that the salaries of the Governor General will not be paid from the British Exchequer, but it will be paid from the Indian revenues. The next important phase in the company's administration is the Charter Act of 1813. So we need to know a little bit of the background of the Charter Act of the 1813. There was a hell lot of pressure which was created by the British industrialist on the British Parliament to end the monopoly of the company. What was the reason? The reason was rise of Napoleon in France and in Europe, and Napoleon created continental system. Many of the European countries were allied with the continental system, and Napoleon barred any kind of trade with the Britain. So, in fact, Britain was at this point of time at the climax of the Industrial Revolution. There were so many manufactured goods to offer to the public, but then there was no market. So at this point of time, these British industrialists, they wanted access to the market of India and China, which was monopolized by the British East India Company. And it is also said that Adam Smith's theory of laissez-faire or free trade theory was also very popular at this point of time, and everybody created pressure citing the name of the Adam Smith laissez-faire. So Charter Act of 1813 was passed in the background of this particular continental system and the rise of Napoleon. Let's come to the provisions. Provision number 1 of this particular act. The company's charter was renewed for next 20 years, but then now it is ending the company's monopoly of trade in India. The company's monopoly of trade in India ended in many of the aspects, but company was able to retain its monopoly in the tea trade in India and also its monopoly with trade with China. Next important provision of this act was, this act allowed the Christian missionaries to go to India and promote Christianity and promote moral and religious education in India. The third important provision of this act was, this act allocated 1 lakh rupees from the Indian revenues for the promotion of education among the Indian subjects. But unfortunately, this money was not made available for many years due to the debate and discussion on mode of education. That is, mode of education must be vernacular or English medium. So it was finally solved in 1833 when William Bentinck was the Governor General of India. The next important provision of this act, that this act empowered local governments to impose taxes on the people, but it was subject to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Only those areas which were there in the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, the local governments of these area only can impose the taxes on the people. Moving on to the most important Charter Act, that was the Charter Act of the 1833. It was also called as St. Helena Act. Let's look at the provisions of the Charter Act of the 1833. Very first, it completely ended the monopoly of the company, be it the tea trade in India, so as trade with China. So now company is no more having any monopoly in any part. Number 2, all the other companies from Britain, now they were allowed to operate in these all places, and this is the act which led to the legal colonization of India. Next important provision. In 1784 Act, 1 member was removed from the Governor General Council, but now in this act, once again a 4th member was added to the Governor General Council. It is to be noted that the 4th member was the legislative member, and he was not the permanent member of the Executive Council. His work was only for the purpose of the legislation, that is rule making, and he was not entitled to vote. So effectively there are 3 executive member and 1 legislative member, and the first legislative member of the Governor General Council was Lord Macaulay. The next important provision of this act was establishment of the first Indian Law Commission. Lord Macaulay was the chairman of the first Indian Law Commission, and this commission was entitled to codify the Indian Penal Code and so as Civil Procedure Code and Criminal Procedure Code of India. And that's how these all act became a reality by 1860s. Section 87 of the Act provided for the education and the employment of Indians in the British services, and it also maintained that there be no discrimination on the basis of race, caste, religion, place of birth or descent. It was the first act which maintained that there would be free admission of Indians in the British administration, or in other words we can say that this was the first act which made a provision to freely admit Indians into the administration without any discrimination. Another provision of this act is that it recommended the Haileybury College in London must make the quota for the future civil servants from India. Though it was not taken seriously, but the provision was mentioned in the 1833 Act. Now, coming to the most important part of the 1833 Act is Governor General of Bengal was now made Governor General of India, and Lord William Bentinck in 1833 became the first Governor General of India. He was the most powerful Governor General till this date. All the financial and political powers were vested in his hand, and moreover, he was entitled to repeal, amend, alter any law or regulation. The only condition was it must be approved by the Court of Directors who were acting under the Board of Control. So only the Court of Directors can disapprove his action, nobody else can disapprove his action. It is to be noted. The next important provision of this act, that this act called for the upliftment of the slaves in India. Another important provision of this act, that this act led to the split in the Bengal presidency and creation of the Agra from the Bengal presidency. Moving on to the next important provision of this act was, it was said that while drafting any law, the rights of the heads of the Indian families must be taken into the consideration, and also the rights related to the marriage or tradition, customs related to the marriage must also be respected while drafting the law. So moving on to the last Charter Act, that is the Charter Act of the 1853. Unlike the other Charter Acts, this Charter Act, though it renewed the company's charter, but it did not fix any timeline for the continuation of the company's administration. So it means that now it was very clear that very soon or any time soon, company can be asked to wind up its operation. Which kind of operation? So basically the administrative operations. Already they have winded up their commercial operations in 1833. Let's move to the next provision of this particular act. This particular act reduced the number of the Court of Directors from 24 to 18, and out of these 18 Court of Directors, 6 were to be appointed or nominated by the British Crown. Another very important provision of this act, or I would say it is the most important provision of this act, now the separation of the Legislative Council with the Executive Council. So now a separate Legislative Council, Governor General Legislative Council, was created with 6 new members. So it is clear indication of the separation of power. Next important provision of this act, out of the 6 new members who were to be the part of the Governor General Legislative Council, 4 were to be recommended by, or 4 were to be chosen by the local governments. Please don't get confused. Local government does not mean the Indian governments or the Indian princely state government. It is basically the local governments of Bombay, Madras, Calcutta and Agra. And moreover, it was also mentioned that those British who have at least completed 10 years in the services of the company, they will be entitled to be nominated in the council. One of the very important provision of this particular Charter Act of 1853 is that it called for entry of Indians in the covenanted civil services, and now it is going to throw open the civil services exam to the Indians. Now Indians would be the part of the civil services, but on the basis of the exam which is to be conducted by the British government. In this regard, to make the syllabus and further make recommendation related to the entry of Indians, once again Macaulay Committee was constituted in 1854. So accordingly, when the exams were thrown open to Indians and exam was conducted, so first Indian to clear this exam was Satyendranath Tagore, who was recommended in 1864. After 4 years of the Charter Act of the 1853, in 1857, the mighty revolt of 1857 happened, and it changed the entire scenario in India, which led to the transfer of power from British East India Company to the British Crown. So after the suppression of the revolt of 1857, in 1858, there was Queen Victoria's Declaration and also Government of India Act 1858. So let's look at the Queen Victoria's proclamation, what she promised to Indians in her proclamation of 1858. Queen Victoria's proclamation was read out by Governor General Canning at a darbar held at Allahabad. And in this particular proclamation, Queen disclaimed any intention of conquest in India, and she also assured that the rights of the Indian princely states would be respected. She also assured Indians that the traditions, customs, usages, rights and beliefs of the Indians would be respected. It also maintained that the British rule will be based on the justice and benevolence, and it further said that Indians would be incorporated into the rule making and so as in the administration without any discrimination on the basis of the caste, creed, religion and place of birth. So Queen Victoria's proclamation came along with the Government of India Act 1858, and some quick provisions of the Government of India Act 1858 are as follows. So very first, now the designation of the Governor General also became the Viceroy of India. Many of you must be confused that what is the difference between Governor General of India and Viceroy of India. The single person was Governor General also and the Viceroy also. So basically, as Viceroy, he is the representative of the British Crown, and as Governor General, he is the administrative head of India. So single person acted in both the capacities. And the first Governor General and the Viceroy was obviously Viceroy Canning or Governor General Canning. Moving on to the next important provision of this particular act. Secretary of State, who was the cabinet minister and who also used to be the president of the Board of Control, now he was made responsible for the Government of India. And moreover, to assist Secretary of State, a 15-member Council of India was created, and this is the Council of India which will be further expanded and it will lead to the creation of the many legislative assemblies in India, be it the Central Legislative Assembly or the Provincial Legislative Assembly. And last but not the least, this is the act which transferred the power from British East India Company to the British Crown, and now the subjects of India would be under the rule of the Crown of the Britain. Since the Government of India Act 1858 came very quickly, so the council provisions were not very elaborated. So there was need of elaborative council provisions. So accordingly, the first Council Act came in 1861. Let's look at the provision of this particular act. Now, it was realized by the British government and the British Crown that they cannot neglect the Indians, and Indians must be incorporated into the rule-making process. So this act led to the inclusion of Indians as non-official members in the Central Legislative Council, which is also called as Imperial Legislative Council. You might be thinking that what is the Central Legislative Council? It is basically the 15-member council which was created earlier, and now it will be having more members. So what is non-official and official? Official members would be the British and non-official member would be the Indians. So now Indians are incorporated into the councils as non-official members. So initially there were 3 Indian members who were included in the Governor General's Council as non-official member. And who were they? So they were Raja of Banaras, Raja of Patiala and Sir Dinkar Rao. And their appointment was for 2 years, and then after 2 years, once again their fate would be decided. Another very important provision of this act, that Governor General or Viceroy was now entitled to go ahead with the portfolio system. And what is portfolio system? Basically creation of the different departments like Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, Department of Health, etc. Another very important provision is Governor General can veto the advice or aid of his members in the council, and this has to be done only on the emergency matters. Apart from it, Governor General was also entitled to issue ordinances in the emergency situations. And if a question is asked that from where we can trace the beginning of the ordinances, so that would be the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Council Act of 1861 also called for establishment of the provincial legislative councils, and accordingly the provincial legislative councils were created in Bengal, Punjab and Northwest Frontier Province, and by the time of the 1892 it was also created in Awadh. So moving on to the Indian Councils Act of 1892. Indian Councils Act of 1892 called for increment in the number of the non-official members, or basically increment in the numbers of the Indians in the legislative councils. So by this point of time, out of the 24 members of the provincial council, only 5 were Indians. Though it is an increment, but then it is not a very great increment in the number of the Indians in the councils. Apart from it, the Indian members of the provincial and the central councils, they were allowed to ask questions on the budget, but it is to be noted that they will have to give a 6-day notice prior to it. Another very important thing is to be noted that Indian members were not allowed to ask supplementary question. And another important provision of this act, that some of these Indians who were the part of the councils, their nomination method was kind of an indirect election method. But it is to be noted, nowhere in the act the word election was mentioned. So now moving on to the 20th century and the acts which were there in the initial decades of the 20th century till the independence of India. So the very first one, Indian Councils Act of 1909, which is also called as Morley Minto Reforms. Morley Minto Reform signifies the names of the Morley and Minto. Minto was the Viceroy of India and Morley was the Secretary of India. So let's look at the important provisions of this act. This act further increased the number of the Indians in the central and the provincial legislative councils. Another very important provision related to the Indian members is some of the members who were nominated in the provincial councils, their nomination was happening through the electoral college, and this electoral college was having members like the privileged class of India, like the rich traders, rich merchants, business class, group of teachers, professors, etc. So basically it was an income based electoral college. The Indian members of the provincial and the central council, now they were given more powers related to the discussion on budget. Now the Indian members were allowed to discuss budget and also vote on the separate budget items. Apart from it, they were also allowed to ask the supplementary questions. The most discriminatory and the most cancerous provision of this particular act was the introduction of the separate electorate or the communal electorate. So now in this act, the Muslim community was given separate electorate, which means that if in a constituency, if election has to happen, so the candidates would be Muslims and the voters would be Muslims. No matter how many Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists or other religious people are there, but they will not be entitled to vote. So it is believed that this is the provision which led to the communal disharmony in India, and this is the provision which led to the partition tendency in the Indian politics. Another very important provision of this act, that one Indian member was to be added to the Viceroy Executive Council, and the first Indian member added to the Viceroy Executive Council was Satyendra Prasad Sinha. Coming on to the next important act, that is Government of India Act 1919, and it is also called as Montagu-Chelmsford Reform, whereby the Chelmsford was the Governor General of India or Viceroy of India, and Montagu was the Secretary of India. So what are the important provisions of this particular act? It increased the number of the Indians in the central and provincial legislative councils, but then it also introduced diarchy in the provinces. So what is diarchy? Diarchy means rule of two, and in the provincial governments or in the provinces, two authorities were created. One is the popular minister and another is the Governor General with his executive council. Accordingly, it divided the subjects into two categories, that is reserved subjects and transferred subjects. Reserved subjects were managed by the governor through his executive councillors, and the transferred subjects were under the realm of the popular ministers. So reserved subjects included some of the important subjects like finance, land revenue, irrigation and law and order. On the other hand, the transferred subjects were like health, education, agriculture, local governments, etc. Moving on to the next important provision of this particular act is, if there is any failure of the constitutional machinery in the state, so in this particular situation, governor with his executive council will be managing the affairs of the state, and basically he will also be managing the transferred subjects. The next important provision of this particular act was introduction of the bicameral legislation at the center. So in the bicameral legislation, the upper house was created for the 3 years, and moreover, there were total 145 members in the upper house. Out of them, 41 were nominated and rest of them, that is 104, were elected. On the other hand, the upper house, the Council of State, had 60 members. Another very important provision of this, or basically the dividing provision of this act, which is the continuation of the divide and policy rule from the 1909, is the extension of the separate electorate for the Anglo-Indian community, Indian Christian community, and so as the Sikh community. The next important provision of this act was basically, it called for giving voting rights to the women, but it was in the realm of the provincial governments to decide when, how and where they will be giving voting rights or franchise to the women. Another very important takeaway from this act is the ministers were responsible to legislature but not the executive councillors. So finally, Government of India Act 1935. The provisions of the Government of India Act 1935 were the results of discussions in the 3 round table conference, recommendations of the Simon Committee, reports of the Joint Select Committee, and also the white papers. It also included the recommendations of the Secretary of the State Samuel Hoare. So coming to the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935, very first one. This act proposed the creation of the All India Federation. And this All India Federation would be comprising of the British ruled provinces and so as the Indian princely states. But there was a condition in the creation of the All India Federation. The condition was half of the princely state must give their consent to join the federation, and the secondary condition was that in the joining princely states, their aggregate population must be more than 50% of the total population of the princely states. As none of these criteria were fulfilled, the All India Federation never became operational. Moving on to the next important provision. This particular act, it removed the diarchy from the provinces and it initiated diarchy in the center. Looking at the provinces, diarchy was removed and provincial autonomy was sought to be provided. Apart from it, bicameral legislation was introduced in the 6 of the provinces out of the 11 provinces of the British India. So these 6 provinces where the bicameral legislation or 2-house legislation or 2-house provision was introduced. These includes UP, Bihar, Odisha, Bombay, Madras and Bengal. These places bicameral legislation was introduced. Moving on to the next important provision of this act, that is the diarchy at the center. So similar to the diarchy at the provinces which was there in the 1909, now at the center, 2 authorities were created, Governor General with his Executive Council and Governor General with the popular ministers. So Governor General with the Executive Council were managing reserved subjects and Governor General with the popular ministers, they were managing the transferred subjects. It also created the 3 list of the legislation, that is provincial, federal and concurrent list of legislation. Another thing that many of the institutions of the Government of India trace their origin to this particular act. So for example, this particular act led to the establishment of the Federal Court of India, which is right now Supreme Court of India, then Federal Public Service Commission of India, which is right now Union Public Service Commission of India, and so as the Provincial Public Service Commissions, that is right now State Public Service Commissions. It also led to the establishment of the Federal Bank of India, which is right now known as Reserve Bank of India. Next important provision, this act enfranchised approximately 10 to 14% of the population of India. This act also called for the establishment of the Federal Railways in India, and that's how railways came under the central government authority. Another very important provision of this act is that it called for separate electorate for the women, though women did not ask for it, but it was a good provision and it was given to the women at this point of time. Apart from it, there was also mention of the separate electorate for the depressed classes, but due to the Pune Pact between Gandhi and Ambedkar, this particular separate electorate for the depressed classes was later amended, and then Pune Pact became the part of the Government of India Act 1935. Last but not the least, I want to add one very important topic from the medieval India and the ancient India. It is one of the practice which is prevalent in India from thousands and thousands of years. So in the last year paper, there was mention of Vatikrutal. Vatikrutal was the practice whereby the Sangam age kings, they were dying facing north direction, and this death was done by fasting. Very similar to this practice of the Vatikrutal, there are some practices which existed in the Rajasthan. I hope all of you must have heard about the Johar. What is Johar? Johar is basically when the dignity of the woman is on the stake, her honor, her respect is on the stake. So she has taken permission from the husband that in this situation she can take her life by jumping in the burning log of the woods. So many such instances of the Johar you must have heard from Rajasthan and many Rajput kingdoms. But apart from the Johar, there is another tradition which existed in the Rajput kingdoms of the Rajasthan and so as the many other areas of India, particularly the northwest and the central India. So what is this? This is called a Sak ritual. So there are many ways of doing the Sak ritual. First of all, when the women have committed Johar, to safeguard their dignity, honor and pride, men also commit Sak ritual whereby In the morning they will be taking the bath, and then they will also be advancing towards that particular burning log of the wood, and they will be sacrificing their life. In another situation, to safeguard their dignity, if they are surrounded by the enemies, so the soldiers would be taking each other's life to safeguard their dignity. This is also the Sak ritual, and one of the best example of the Sak ritual is the Raja Hambir Dev of Ranthambore Fort. When Alauddin Khilji entered into the Ranthambore Fort, and then Raja Hambir Dev realized that he cannot win against the Alauddin Khilji. So what he did, that he went atop his Shiv temple, and there he cut his head with his own hand. That was also the Sak ritual. So it's not just the women who commit Johar, but also the men also committed this kind of brave act to safeguard their dignity. Another question which was there in the last year paper, which actually led to confusion among the people, that what has been asked, and it was actually a name of the coin which was asked in the last year paper, that is Pranam. So there were many such coins in the medieval India. Just remember the name, that is Jittal, Tanka, Adha, Bikh, Bahloli, Hastagani, Dukani, Sultani, Muhammadi, Varaha, Jalali, Muhar, Asarfi, etc. So with this, we are ending this episode of the Culture Quantum, and the team Culture Quantum has tried to bring important topics from the ancient medieval art and culture and modern Indian history. I hope it will help you, and in this last week, I would just request to you, revise, revise and revise. In this last week, don't panic, be cool, calm and composed, and have faith in the God. Team Culture Quantum wishes you all the best and perform well in the exam. Thank you for watching Culture Quantum, and please do not forget to share, subscribe, like, comment and recommend the channel Culture Quantum. Thank you.